To the American public, Lucille Ball was the undisputed queen of comedy. The fiery redhead with the elastic face and perfect timing had not only conquered television, but had built an empire doing it. As the head of Desilu Studios, she was the most powerful woman in Hollywood, a titan who had transformed the industry from the inside out. She shared a handshake with presidents, broke glass ceilings with a well-timed pratfall, and made the world laugh. But behind the warm, inviting smile she wore for the cameras, Lucy carried a private burden, a seething, cold fury directed at one man. The public assumed she adored her co-stars. The truth was far more complicated. While she had her disagreements with Desi Arnaz and her frustrations with others, there is substantial evidence to suggest that the person Lucille Ball truly hated more than anyone else in the world was not a rival actress or a cruel producer. It was the man she helped make a star, Henry C. Rogers, her longtime publicist. The betrayal, as Lucy saw it, was not a sudden explosion but a slow, corrosive leak. Rogers had been with her for decades. He was the architect of her public image, the man who spun her divorce from Desi into a story of resilient independence, who framed her transition from actress to studio head as a natural, graceful evolution. For years, Lucy trusted him with her life. He knew about the marital fights, the business gambles, the moments of crippling insecurity. He was, by all accounts, her professional confidant. But in the ruthless ecosystem of classic Hollywood, loyalty was often just a line item on a contract. The hatred, according to biographers like Stephen Canfer and Charles Tranberg, began to crystallize in the late 1960s as Lucy sensed Rogers was no longer working for her. He was managing the narrative for his own benefit. She began to notice that the stories fed to columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons weren't just protecting her. They were making him indispensable. The first crack appeared when she realized Rogers had been quietly negotiating deals that positioned him as a power broker, using her name as leverage without her explicit consent. The true venom, however, was reserved for the disaster that was the film Mame in 1974. This is where the authentic source material, Lucy's own letters and the accounts of her production staff, reveals the depth of her animosity. Lucy had poured her soul into the role of the eccentric Auntie Mame. It was supposed to be her grand cinematic triumph, a chance to prove that the queen of sitcom could rule the box office. But she was exhausted, battling a crippling case of anemia, and the production was a nightmare. Instead of shielding her, Rogers reportedly saw an opportunity. As the film faced brutal reviews and ballooning costs, sources close to the production claimed that Rogers began planting stories that shifted the blame for the film's failure away from the producers and onto Lucy herself. He subtly implied she was too old, too sick, too difficult. When Lucy discovered that her own publicist was feeding unflattering background details to journalists to save his relationships with the studio executives, something inside her broke. A close friend later recalled Lucy's voice trembling with rage as she said, "I built that man's career. I gave him a house, and he handed them the knife to stab me with." What made the hatred so profound was not just the betrayal, but the public performance of loyalty that Rogers maintained. To the world, he was still the smiling guardian at her side. He wrote the press releases praising her resilience. He orchestrated her interviews. But Lucy, a master of physical comedy, who could convey contempt with a single raised eyebrow, began a cold war. She stopped taking his calls directly, forcing her assistant to screen them. She would deliberately contradict his press releases in private conversations, letting the truth slip out just to feel the sting of honesty. In a 1976 interview that was later locked away in the archives of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, Lucy reportedly vented, "You want to know the cruelest part? He knows where all the bodies are buried because he helped me dig the graves. And then he started selling shovels to my enemies." This was the crux of her hatred. It wasn't just greed. It was the intimacy of the wound. Only someone who knew exactly where to strike could hurt her that badly. The final rupture came after the death of her second husband, Gary Morton. In the early 1980s, Lucy was a widow navigating the twilight of her career. Rogers, sensing her vulnerability, attempted to leverage their history to secure a massive deal for her official memoirs, a deal that would give him a percentage of the royalties and, more importantly, editorial control. He wanted to soften her legacy, to erase the messy parts about the main disaster and her later struggles. Lucy refused. In a savage move that shocked the industry, she fired him via a one-line letter delivered by a courier. She then hired a young, aggressive lawyer to audit Rogers' files. What they found, though much remained sealed, reportedly included evidence that Rogers had been charging personal expenses to Lucy's production company for years, framing them as crisis management fees. Biographer Kathleen Brady notes that when Lucy saw the ledgers, she didn't scream. She went silent. That silence, those who knew her said, was the most terrifying thing about her. It was the silence of a woman who realized she had been played for a fool, and she would never forgive the player. In her final years, living a quieter life in Beverly Hills, Lucille Ball made it a point of spiteful pride to never mention Henry Rogers' name again. If a journalist asked about her publicists, she would list the names of her assistants, her lawyers, even her gardener, but she would stop cold at his name. A famous anecdote from her housekeeper reveals that when a draft of a television special accidentally credited Rogers as a consultant, Lucy took a red pen and scratched his name out so violently that she tore the paper. When asked if she wanted to issue a correction, she simply said, "No, I want him erased." That was the depth of her disdain. She had tolerated the tyrannical directors, the icy actresses, the philandering executives, but the man who smiled while he stole her legacy, that was a crime she could not laugh off. The irony, of course, is that history often forgets the publicist. We remember Lucy's slapstick, her pioneering spirit, her red hair. We forget the name Henry C. Rogers. But Lucy never did. In the quiet, dark moments between the laughter, she would sit on her patio and stare at the Hollywood Hills, and according to her daughter, Lucy Arnaz, she would occasionally mutter, "There is a special place in hell for people who use your trust as a ladder." She didn't hate Desi for the drinking. She didn't hate the studio heads for the sexism. She hated Rogers because he proved that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one who attacks you from the front. It is the one who stands beside you, holding your coat, while waiting for you to fall. And that, more than any on-screen rivalry or backstage spat, was the hatred that truly defined her final, unguarded years.